Alright, put it in the can. So before I get too far into the project, I wanted to take out all the hardware first to see what it requires as far as spacing and measurements and all that stuff, because I think with a project like this, you need to build around the hardware. All right, go ahead, guys. You're scaring me. Can you give me a clamp over there?
Puzzle.
Now before I started cutting the frame for the door, I mocked up this contraption here. Using some 2x, some plywood, and the hardware for the barn door, I wanted to make sure, one, that the thickness of the door was going to be good, which was going to be 2x, but I also, more importantly, wanted to test that I was going to build the frame to the right length of the door. So I built this in a way where I could adjust the height of the door, and if it was too short, I could just turn these little screws here and slide this down this little slot that I made with a router. In the end, I found my final height for the door, and then I went to cutting the frame. Now I want to give the paneling on the doors a bit of a tongue and groove kind of look without actually going through the hassle of building the tongue and groove boards. So I'm going to use plywood here. I'm going to use my table saw to cut some shallow grooves into it, and it'll look just like tongue and groove. Of the door though, I want to just touch upon something. If you run into problems when you're assembling the door, specifically if the plywood panels aren't fitting into these grooves. Now there's ways you can correct this. You can run the table saw, you can rip through these grooves one more time just to widen up this groove, and that's going to allow the plywood to fit. I also recommend while you're doing this, take a small piece of plywood that's the same thickness as the plywood you're using for the panels of the door, and yeah, just take this small piece and run it through the groove and see if you're running into any tight spots. Now when you're using a table saw with this method, that's just going to be kind of the nature of it, where it's not going to be a perfect straight long cut, especially on these long boards. You're going to get a more consistent width if you're using, say, like a router and you're just going through the long ports of the board here. But anyway, if you can't run the table saw through this to rip these slots even wider, what I'm doing here, because I'm running into the same problem, is I'm just marking out where it's a little tight on this groove here, and I'm using a chisel and just making small little kind of cuts in there to widen up the groove. Anyway, that'll make assembly a lot easier. this next part's a little tough to just do with masking tape and music, so I gotta kind of tell you what I'm doing here. But the last thing to do is cut a little channel or a groove at the bottom of the doors so it'll fit this little guide, this little metal guide that will help keep the door aligned as it slides back and forth, and this keeps it from bumping into the wall or getting pushed out too far. So to do this, I need to remove the hardware from the top of the door, flip it upside down. I'm going to prop it up against my ladder, and then I've made a little jig here for my circular saw so I can run it in a straight line across the bottom of the door. Now, the width of the metal guide is actually a little wider than my saw blade, so I actually have to make 2 passes. I'm going to do 1 pass with the jig, and then I'm going to put quarters just to kind of wedge the guide a little bit further out and make another pass with my circular saw. So that should allow the channel or the groove to be wide enough for the little metal guide to pass through. Oh yeah, one other thing is I had to remove the very bottom pocket screws on the door. That way I wasn't sawing through them, and then I just put them back in after the groove was cut. Let me know if you've got a different method on how to put this groove on the bottom of the door. It's the most effective method I could think of with the jig and the circular saw and the quarters. But yeah, leave your comments below.
For step-by-step instructions, go to gadgetsandcrane.com. Cheese.